I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise tonight to speak following the tabling of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade's report into Australia's relationship with the countries of Africa. At this stage, I'd like to pay tribute to the Chair of that committee, Senator Forshaw, and Deputy Chair, the member for Gilmore, as well as the Secretariat for their hard work in making this report possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, Africa may not be in our diplomatic backyard, like Asia is, or indeed the South Pacific, but it is an important part of Australia's foreign policy outlook. We have significant aid, strong people-to-people links, strategic interests, and we engage in a multitude of global organisations with our African partners. Indeed, Africa is a continent of up to 1 billion people. It's made up of 53 countries, each with their different traditions, their different languages. Some 3,000 different languages are spoken in Africa, different religions, and this provides for many challenges and opportunities. Indeed, in terms of challenges, 33 of the 49 most poorest countries in the world come from Africa. And indeed, there's real issues of governance. But there is also great opportunity. People are innovative, there is extensive resource wealth, and there is a movement of many millions of people out of poverty into the middle classes. And Australia has an opportunity to work with the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and the Southern African Development Community to try to reach common answers to common problems. In terms of this report, there are a number of significant recommendations, some of which I hope the government does take up. One is to call for greater cooperation between the private sector, government agencies, NGOs in developing and delivering aid to Africa. Second, talks about a regulatory framework for the resources sector, that Australia, using its own experience with our strong resources sector, can help develop such a regulatory framework that could assist countries in Africa develop their resources. Significantly, the report recommends that we review our diplomatic representation in Africa, particularly in the Francophone countries. Our presence in Africa has decreased from 12 diplomatic missions to 8 in the past 25 years. We have significantly less diplomatic representation than a number of our trading partners, such as Canada, Korea, Malaysia. Not to say we have significantly less diplomatic representation in Africa than the United States, Japan and the United Kingdom. I welcome the opening of a mission in Addis Ababa, which is the headquarters of the African Union, and recognise that the committee has suggested we increase the number of honorary consuls in Africa, as well as the A-based French-speaking diplomatic staff. There's also opportunities for Australia to develop valuable ties in research and higher education. This includes the offering of more scholarships for African students to study here, and the interesting idea of a Centre for African Studies to be located at an Australian university. There's also scope for an Australia-Africa Council, which can be used to expand trade and cultural links. I remember when Alexander Downer was the Foreign Minister back in 2000, and the Council for Latin American Relations was set up, and that helped deepen and strengthen the ties between Australia and Latin American countries. There are great trading opportunities in agriculture, resources, tourism, but if you look at the statistics today, less than 1% of our imports come from Africa, and just over 1.5% of our exports go to Africa. So clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is great opportunities for Australian businesses to partner with African countries to our mutual benefit. In conclusion, I just wanted to talk about one issue which I think is very important in terms of Australia's policy to the African continent. And that's about how we can improve the democratic rights of the Zimbabwean people. Back in 2005, I wrote an article that was published in the Courier Mail about the UN's failure to pressure Mugabe and how it was back then an indictment on the UN membership and the values that it professes to hold. The basket of Africa, the food basket of Africa, was Zimbabwe, and it has quickly turned into the basket case of Africa. President Mbeki was supposed to be the honest broker to try to bring Zimbabwe to the table. Well, that didn't succeed. President Mugabe bulldozed hundreds of thousands of people's temporary dwellings and poor people's dwellings in Harare, leaving hundreds of thousands, estimated to be 700,000 people, homeless. Inflation and unemployment was skyrocketing, the currency was worthless, and still the international community, and particularly Zimbabwe's African neighbours, stood still and stood quiet. Would you believe that Zimbabwe was elected to a 3-year term for the UN Human Rights Commission? I'm all for international bodies, but when they kick dirt in our face by electing the likes of Zimbabwe to a UN human rights body, you've got to ask what it's all about. Clearly, quiet diplomacy, Madam Deputy Speaker, does not work with Zimbabwe, and something more dramatic needs to be done. You may be aware that after the failed elections in 2008, there was a so-called power-sharing agreement between President Mugabe and Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai from the Movement for Democratic Change. Well, lo and behold, nothing has happened. We haven't had fresh elections, we haven't had a new constitution, and we are now a couple of years on. So why isn't Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard speaking about this more often? Why aren't they speaking to the Australian public and to their partners in Africa and elsewhere about the disgrace that is Zimbabwe? I noticed that the South African development community has recently said that Zimbabwean leaders need to be urged, and I quote, to create a conducive environment to the holding of elections that will be free and fair under conditions of a level playing field. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I also note that the so-called Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe is telling us that a third of the members or the names on the electors' roll are dead, and that the government has no money to conduct a new election. That is no excuse to suspend human rights or to abuse human rights and suspend democracy. See, Mugabe is a dictator of the worst kind, and it's an indictment on many of our international partners that something more has not been done. And the ZANU-PF, Mugabe's military arm and political arm, are thugs. And what they do is they try to intimidate their political opponents. And the rapes and the bashings and the poverty, there's no education and health system to speak of. Thousands of people have died of cholera. It's completely intolerable. And I know that Kevin Rudd thinks that he's going to bring peace to mankind, and particularly to Libya. But why doesn't he pay some more attention to Zimbabwe, Foreign Minister? Isn't it time that Australia, as a Commonwealth nation, made Zimbabwe an absolute priority for our foreign policy, because there might be a power sharing agreement between Morgan Tsvangirai and President Mugabe, but it's a power sharing agreement in name only. There's no real democracy, there are no human rights, and millions of people lie scared in their beds. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this report is a valuable contribution from the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. It points to how we can strengthen our relationships with the countries of Africa. As I said at the start, Africa may not be in our diplomatic backyard like Asia and the South Pacific is, but it is a very valuable country in terms of Australia's global interests. And we have a moral obligation to help the millions of people in Africa who are dealing with extreme poverty and a lack of governance. So I pay tribute to the Chair of the Committee, Senator Forshaw, its Deputy Chair, the Member for Gilmore, the Secretariat for their important work. But I say to our Foreign Minister and our Prime Minister, Zimbabwe is a blight on the world under Mugabe, and it's a blight on your foreign policy record. With CHOGM about to happen in Australia, there is no better time for you as the Australian government to use your voice in international forums, your voice here at home, to make the case for change in Zimbabwe and the end of the disastrous dictatorship that is the Mugabe regime.